Since we're interested in history, let me begin with the FM story. Force Multiplier began early in 2017 when a group of friends gathered in Brookline, Massachusetts, recovering from the gut punch of the 2016 elections and tried to figure out, how do you solve a problem like the Donald? After an idea here and there, the best solution seemed to be to combine the forces of people and purse and use them where they would have the most influence electorally. Our goals were to turn DC blue, to use your dollars strategically, and to ensure that everyone can and does vote. Since that time, we've gained 15,000 contributors from all 50 states, hosted conversations with dozens of candidates, activists, and influencers, and are approaching $22 million in donations. We are all volunteers. We conduct exhaustive research to find candidates who can best turn the electoral map. Every dollar we raise goes to candidates and partner organizations through Act Blue. We've requested questions in advance this evening, and we have received more than 50. We won't be taking new questions in chat. If you would like to learn more about Force Multiplier or have other questions, we invite you to an information session tomorrow evening, 8 o'clock Eastern Time, and this information session is free. Without further delay, let me tell you about our special guest. You know the esteemed Heather Cox Richardson from her award-winning publications spanning subjects from the Civil War and Reconstruction to the Gilded Age, the American West, and the history of the Republican Party through Donald Trump. Her past Vox podcast, Then and Now with Joanne Freeman, her Tuesday Facebook live chats, and her blog, Letters from an American, which reaches 1.5 million people daily. The New Yorker's Jane Meyer has called her book, Democracy Awakening, Notes on the State of America, which was published in September 2023, a vibrant and essential history of America's unending, enraging, and utterly compelling struggles since its founding to live up to its own best ideals. That book will be available in paperback in October. And if I can engage in a little personal talk, Heather, you take a really nice sunset photo. And during these times when hope seems completely out of reach, your words have probably talked many a Democrat down from the figurative ledge, and we are grateful. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much. And it's such a pleasure to be here. And, you know, what's funny about what you just said is that indeed, I think about 40 days ago, many of us were wondering what the future was going to hold. And we are now looking at an entirely new America. And in a way, it doesn't surprise me because for many years, I have been reassuring people that this country tends to turn on a dime. But it doesn't feel that way when you're waiting for that dime to drop, right? So we're in this moment where we have really to choose the future of this country. And because of the importance of the United States, the future really of the globe. And on the one hand, we have the MAGA Republicans who are not your mother's Republicans, who are actively working to destroy democracy. And on the other side, we have the Democrats who are building in this moment a brand new, very large coalition. And that's extraordinarily exciting to me. But first, let me just rehearse a little bit what the Republicans are up to right now, because it's really quite fascinating. And remember that I'm the historian of the Republican Party. So in a funny way, these are my people. Like you can't study somebody in the depth of which I have studied the major Republican figures and a lot of the minor Republican figures in our history and not feel somewhat like their family, just because, you know, if you have read all of Eisenhower's letters, in many ways, you know him better than you know your brother, right? So the Republican Party right now has painted itself into a corner, in part because leading up to 2016 and the emergence of Donald Trump as the presidential nominee in that year, the Republicans really had tried to marry the idea of neoliberalism and the idea of getting rid of business regulations and getting rid of taxes and so on, with reactionary uh, um, cultural base that was comprised both of the racists who had come into the party from the Democrats after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, with the traditionalists who came out of fundamentalist Christianity at the turn of the last century. So the people who were behind, for example, the Scopes trial, ended up in the Republican Party, and they made this sort of unholy marriage where the libertarian business wing relied on those cultural reactionary people to get the votes they needed to stay in power. But what Trump did when he took over was he started to give the libertarian wing of the libertarian business wing of the party, the tax cuts and the deregulation it wanted. But increasingly, especially after the turn in summer of 2017 to the reactionary right after the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, he increasingly put that reactionary cultural group at the head of the Republican Party. And especially after the events of January 6, 2021, he really made them the driving force of the party. And what that has meant is that today's Republican Party, the MAGA Republicans, have left behind that business wing, and they have left behind the traditions of the party. And instead, we have a new thing in the United States of America, and that is a major political party, one with an illustrious history, that is rejecting democracy and instead calling for a new kind of government. And it's a government that's patterned on that government of people like Viktor Orban of Hungary quite deliberately. And what it calls for is actually outlined in Project 2025, about which I'm sure everybody has heard, and I'm happy to talk about it. But the key to Project 2025 is that it calls essentially for the destruction of American democracy and the centering of a very strong president, a very strong executive who is able to call to fill our civil service, which is more than 2 million people, with his loyalists, to destroy the idea of equality before the law and put his own loyalists in charge of our legal system and the Department of Justice, and also to put his own loyalists in at the military. Now, with all that power, he then would get rid of the secular instruments of our democracy that we have built up really since the beginning, and replace them with Christian nationalism, a worldview that looks very much like, again, that of Viktor Orban, to get rid of abortion, for example, get rid of LGBTQ plus rights, get rid of women's rights, get rid of minority, racial and ethnic minority rights, and create a system, a caste system in the United States, which would be enshrined into our system in such a way that, as Donald Trump says, people would no longer have to vote. So in Hungary, for example, they still have elections, but because Viktor Orban's party controls the media and controls the opposition and controls the voting system and controls the counting, we all know how those elections are going to come out. So we have that on one side, and that's been growing for a while, right? This is not like it came out of nowhere. And there have been people along the way for a long time now. And I just don't mean just in Trump's time, but really since the rise of Ronald Reagan, who, and even before that, really, who've been saying we have a problem here because the direction that this party is going to paint itself into a corner, into a cul-de-sac, if you will, and not be able to get out of it. And we seem to be at that moment. Because what we have now is the Democratic Party, which took the reins really under President Joe Biden in 2020, and then when he's elected in 2021, and Vice President Kamala Harris. And they very deliberately rejected the neoliberalism of the previous 40 years and instead said, no, rather than trusting the markets to work things out, we are going to do what people like FDR did and people like Eisenhower did and Truman and Kennedy. We're going to invest in ordinary people with the Keynesian argument that if in fact you rely on the government to regulate business and to provide a basic social safety net so that people who are just starting out and people who don't have a ton of money can actually have enough money that they can buy things and that they can have a decent standard of living. And then if we invest in infrastructure so that everybody has access to the same tools of the modern economy, and mind you, this is kind of a bit of an issue for me because where I live, we still don't have broadband. So I'm not in my home right now. I have to borrow somebody's, actually, it's kind of a shack because this person has cable. I do not. But if we have investment in infrastructure, and then we also have the protection of civil rights, that will create a thriving economy, a growing economy, and that will not only provide for people economically, what that will do is it will reduce the tensions in society. And in American history, when people feel good about putting food on their table, it also means that they are far more willing to accord rights to the people around them who are gender minorities or racial minorities or ethnic minorities. So they made this gamble, and by God, it worked. Right? But they did something else, and that is that rather than centering what were essentially heteronormative, usually white men in a nuclear family, which is a really post-World War II construction. That's never been what families were before that. Previous presidents had really established a certain kind of society. And one of the things that Biden and Harris did was that they tried to center children. Now, they didn't always manage it. They didn't get all the legislation they wanted, but rather than centering the man to provide for a family, they centered children with the idea that that would then enable the society to protect its most vulnerable, and it would not privilege a certain kind of family structure. So while they were up to that, of course, you know that we had Trump and his MAGA Republicans taking more and more grip of the Republican Party. And as they did so, they packed the state apparatus, the state Republican apparatus in states that were dominated by Republicans with their own people. Not with establishment Republicans, but with their own people. And they also took over the apparatus of the Republican National Committee. And that's really going to matter for where I'm going, because they got rid of even people like Ron McDaniel, who was Trump's handpicked chair of the Republican National Committee, and replaced her with Trump's own daughter-in-law and own handpicked loyalist, Michael Whatley. That they also changed the structure, the financial structure of the Republican Party so that it flowed first to Donald Trump. And crucially, they took over the email lists and the outreach lists that the Republican Party had pulled together for decades. All right, so while they were doing that and continuing to push the big lie and to try to undermine our legal system, Biden and Harris's attempts to rebuild American society were working. We know we've gotten more than 800,000 manufacturing jobs back in the United States, in addition to the jobs that were replaced and the jobs that were created after the worst of the coronavirus pandemic. They've actually brought manufacturing back. They have stabilized our supply chains. They have created a system that now, after almost 4 years, about 3.5 years that they've been in office, people are aware actually works. All right, so I gave you that back setup because when on July 21st, when President Biden said he would not accept the Democratic nomination for president, he did something really interesting, and we could talk about that if you're interested, but by putting Kamala Harris at the head of the ticket, which was a very deliberate effort, in fact, I think what we are seeing, first of all, is a lot of things moving all at once. I mean, this has been a really, really fluid period in our history. And it's a very odd thing for someone like me to watch because I'm used to analyzing it from later. And to be part of it is, I feel sort of like I'm constantly looking all over to see what's going on. But the base of the Democratic Party, since the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, by the way, the 59th anniversary of that was yesterday, meant that the base of the Republican Party was women and people of color, primarily Black people, and primarily Black women. And so to have Kamala Harris representing the party was fitting, right? It worked. But Tim Walz brings something else. And this, I think, is really interesting because what Tim Walz brings is akin to the old-fashioned LBJ, FDR, let's help the little guy economics that President Biden brought to the ticket and so masterfully put into place. But Walz brings a history of Midwestern progressivism. And the Midwestern progressivism of the turn of the century, from the 19th century to the 20th century, really dramatically reshaped the United States. And it reshaped it not only in economic ways, although that tends to be what people focus on when they look, for example, at the rise of regulation or at the fact that we get the concept of income taxes protected by the Constitution. What it also dramatically restructures education and healthcare and the cultural and social world of the country, not least by centering women in that, because it was actually women who were the centerpiece of the progressive movement. And so what I feel like we're seeing right now is a moment in which we have for so long looked at the MAGA Republicans and been afraid of them. And they have fed on that because they were feeding an authoritarian movement, and that feeds on fear. But by creating this Republican Party that is completely glued to Trump, if you will, financially, socially, it really is a cult-like party. What they have done is they have created a moment in which they have run headlong into that brick wall at the end of the cul-de-sac and left the party shattered. That is, the economic system is in terrible trouble of the party, the people, everything is shattered. At the same time that the Democratic Party is saying, hey, remember us over here? Please come join us. Even if you're a Republican, you don't have to become a Democrat to join us. We want you over here because we want to protect American democracy. And in that larger protection of American democracy, there's going to be room for a lot of different voices. And me, Heather Richardson, speaking as a historian, will tell you that group is going to split looking into our future. And it's probably going to split into at least two political parties. But what we have in this moment is this time where we get to choose democracy, but crucially, we also get to choose what that democracy is going to look like. And so for this moment, it is phenomenally important that everybody turns out, because even though there's enormous momentum building up behind Harrison Walz, there's no doubt that this is still going to be a very close election, and we must be there for it. And we must be there for everywhere up and down the ballot. And this means whether or not you're a Democrat or an independent or a Green or a Republican or a Martian who has the right to vote here. We need to have every voice out there, everybody participating, both in volunteering and in putting money where they possibly can, and in and talking to people and make sure people understand this. It means that we must be there for this election, but that this is this moment where Americans get to redefine what American democracy looks like for the future. And this is so crucially important right now in a time when we need to figure out how we as a globe can address climate change and can address future pandemics. That I have always said, this is a moment where we get to recognize the bad things that could happen, but also to look around us and recognize that anytime we throw the cards up in the air, it's also a time of extraordinary creativity. And if you look around us and you see the new voices and the new languages and the new music and the new art and the new ways of thinking about society and the new political programs and the new ways of advertising and all the new things going on, you see what a creative time this is. But this is the time when we get to bring that creativity to the actual construction of our democracy. And when I think about that, and when I think about the fact that, speaking personally, I feel like I spent my entire adult life fighting a holding action to make sure we did not lose democracy, first to an oligarchy and then to a dictator. When I look at this moment and think that maybe I will have the opportunity to put my weight behind a new America that can take on the crises of the 21st century and find new and better answers to them, I feel like we're unbelievably lucky, and that having the right and the responsibility to fight in this moment for our future is an incredible blessing. So that's why I'm here tonight and happy to answer questions and about really anything. And let's see if we can take this out and do this not only effectively, but also with some enthusiasm and joy.
Heather, an entirely new America. I like the sound of that. I'm Esther Kaplan, co-chair of the Force Multiplier Political Research Committee. And before we go to more of a conversation with Heather, I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about who we're supporting tonight and why. We're all feeling the momentum, but let's remember that we felt that in 2020. And even so, Biden beat Trump in the Electoral College by fewer than 44,000 votes across 3 states. That's 44,000 votes out of over 158 million votes cast. It's going to be close again. To get into the weeds a bit, in recent elections, frequent voters, those who vote in every election, leaned Republican by 3 points. Sporadic voters, those who vote sometimes, favored Democrats by 3 points. Fern, could you put up the slide, please? However, there's a subsection of sporadic voters that leans Democratic by 12 points. We call them the blue surge. And we won in 2018 and 2020 and did better than expected in 22 House races by turning out blue surge voters. Our partner, America Votes, has done the research and identified those voters. And based on analysis of past election data, they project 2.8 million blue surge voters across the 7 presidential battleground states. There are also red surge voters, but if both sides pull out their surge voters, we have a solid advantage in each state. So who are they? 63% of them are under 34 years old, and 59% are of color. They don't live and breathe politics. They may work 2 jobs to take care of their families or their cats. Some aren't sure that who's president makes a difference, and most get their news from social media. So anybody and any bot can and is putting disinformation in front of them. We can stop sharing, Fern. Research and common sense tells us that direct interaction is the best way to cultivate voters. Talk to them. And it's best done by a trusted messenger, a friend or neighbor, a peer, knocking on their door, listening to what issues are important to them, providing the information they need, and helping them overcome any barriers to voting. America Votes is the largest convener of progressive grassroots organizing groups nationwide. They give lists of the targeted voters to groups they fund in each state, and they helped us choose 4 or 5 of those groups per state, 40 total in the fund. Each is of and for a specific constituency. So for example, one PA engages Black voters in Allegheny County in Western PA, and also in Philadelphia, Chester, and Darby counties in Eastern PA. Another one, Raza, engages mostly young rural Arizona voters, and they do it in English and Spanish. All groups are vetted, and America Votes monitors their progress. They're canvassing, texting, and using social media, and through that, they build relationships with those voters year-round, and so when election time comes, they are the trusted messenger. I encourage you to go to the Blue Surge Turnout Fund on the Voter Empowerment tab on our website and read about all 40 groups. Your donations go only to the groups. Force Multiplier takes nothing. America Votes takes nothing. Our next event on August 29th will feature leaders of some of those groups, and they'll be telling us about what they're hearing at the doors. So our role is to support them. They're doing a great job and they need our support. There's been an outpouring of money for the Harris Walls campaign and for our great House and Senate candidates, but these groups still have a yawning budget gap. So let's do our part to meet this moment in history by helping our fellow Americans understand and exercise the power of their vote. Thanks. And now we're going to go to co-chair Tom Halleck and your questions for Heather.
No, thanks, Esther. And Heather, it's such an honor to have you with us tonight. We're so grateful for Letters from an American, and I don't know if you realize how much it's really been part of our daily lives and how much you've enabled us to understand our times and reminded us of the power that we have as citizens in a democracy. Thank you for that.
Well, thank you, but do remember that I'm just the vehicle for the questions that people ask, the problems they come to me with, the things they want to know. And I'm my real skill is research. That's always what I was known for when I was just writing history books. And I've turned into a pretty good writer at this point, but I've always thought that I was the coffee pot that people were gathering around. And I think you can see that. I think I was in the right place at the right time. And I think you can see that with the real surge now in the present of people really taking control of democracy back. And for a number of years, there was always this sense that, somebody had to come save us. And we're not waiting for people to come save us any longer. We're turning out and saving ourselves.
Well, it's really remarkable to see what's happening in this moment where you get these. I mean, all of the energy before felt like it was kind of this pushing energy from, the Democratic Party or the Biden campaign or groups like ours. Now it's just been unleashed. There's this spontaneous energy. I was on a call with 11,000 people, elders for Kamala the other night, and you've been on some huge ones yourselves. So it's really remarkable. And I wonder if we could start there. Could you just say a little bit about how you might contrast the new Harris Walls ticket with the Trump Vance ticket and how much the vibe of the campaign has changed in just 2.5 weeks?
Yes, it's actually really interesting. So if you look at the Trump Vance ticket, and by the way, it's very funny. I see words as shapes, and when they have the same number of letters, it just about kills me. So I'm having a terrible time here. At least Harris is 6 and Walls is 4, but Vance and Trump are both 5. So I may not be able to get all the names right here. But Vance and Trump don't have any policies. They truly don't have any policies, which is really interesting if you think about it, because what they're trying to do is run basically a campaign around Trump, and a campaign around Trump that is based in fear. Those people are going to do things to you. So today, for example, Trump called into Fox and Friends and tried to talk about the Harris Walls ticket and said that Walls was going to race America to communism immediately or even faster. And you're like, really? Are we really going to try and win an election based on communism again? That's like not a starter, right? And I could go on down the list, but with the people having turned against Project 2025, they really just don't have anything except this fake image that is almost like a cartoonish image of what the Republicans like William F. Buckley Jr. in the 1950s or Reagan in the 1980s talked about, the idea of the little guy being protected and so on. At the same time, in contrast, and they're based in fear. The idea is to make you afraid of somebody. And in contrast to that, Harris and Walls have really leaned into joy and creation and the idea of protecting freedom. If you look at the way they're talking, they are talking about American values, small town values, protecting freedom, staying out of people's lives, all the sorts of things that quite oddly would have sounded Republican 40 years ago. And the real thing that jumps out to me is that they really are focused on joy and community and friendship. And that's a place I think that they really differed from Biden, because Biden has always been really, really, really good at what he does. And he is not slipping, if anybody is wondering, he really is not. But he focused on negotiations, staying in the background, getting stuff done. And that's excellent if you're focusing on governance. It doesn't campaign very well. And it certainly looks as if, with the reduction of this campaign to a 3-month period, which in many ways is cool, it's new, I'm happy to talk about that, new and very old. What Harris clearly did with Walz is leaned into the idea that they're going to run with this idea of joy and creation and creating a new America. And once they get in office, then they're going to continue and build on the policies of the Biden administration. But it's almost like it's just two completely different visions of the country, two different visions of governance. And those two visions, the one really serves authoritarianism and the other really serves democracy. And it's just fascinating to watch.
So, well, along those lines, another thing, and you wrote about this in one of your recent columns, is that Walz represents a resettling of the Democratic Party and that he's from rural America. You're talking to us from a place that doesn't have broadband, from a friend's house. What do you think rural voters are open to hearing Walz and Democrats? And what else can the Democrats do to win back rural voters?
You'll be shocked to hear I have strong ideas about this. I actually think that, I joke about how I'm tired of all these studies of what's wrong with rural America, like we're zoo animals, because there's nothing wrong with rural America. We have the same issues as other places and different issues as well. But what really makes a difference between a Trump voter in a rural area and a non-Trump voter is media consumption. People who listen to talk radio and people who listen to the Fox News channel turn to the right. People who did not listen to those things did not make the same turn. So one of the things about Walz is that he really is articulating the progressive values. They call them progressive values these days, but they're really Eisenhower values. I mean, and really they've been traditional values in rural areas always. He's articulating those and he's claiming them for the Democratic Party, standing proudly on them. And are people willing to accept that? I think absolutely, because anybody who lives in a rural area knows that, above all, public education really matters in a place where there isn't private education. So the voucher system, for example, will simply decimate public schools in places like where I live. Similarly, being able to control healthcare and being able to control reproductive care is enormously important in anywhere, but certainly in a rural area. So I think that they will. I think what is an interesting observation is that people have said that he is what people's fathers and grandfathers were before they watched the Fox News channel. And there's a lot to that. He really harks back in many ways to the kind of father figure that I grew up with, the people who came out of World War II, for whom community was everything. And certainly protecting community and protecting the health of children and the education of children was paramount. And I think he speaks to that. I think it's just really interesting because the Democratic Party right now, and I'm planning to write about this weekend, the Democratic Party's roots were always in small town America. And it's got a long history, so there's some caveats in that. But they really lost the rural vote in many ways with the rise of Adlai Stevenson in the 50s, which was a deliberate attempt to intellectualize the party. And the Republicans really ran with that, as I say, after the Voting Rights Act of 65 by saying, oh, those elites in the East want to impose on you desegregation. And that, you look at Reagan's time for choosing speech, and then of course his speech in 1980 when he went into the White House, and the denigration of a far off elite, by which he meant Democrats. And the Democrats really had a hard time picking that back up for, again, I think largely because of media consumption. And Walls is quite unabashedly snatching it back and saying, you know, the Democrats represent me. And he's not the first to do it, mind you, but him being a male, older football coach, I think is a really powerful statement in a way that, for example, Jess Piper of Missouri, who's been great about demanding that we really recognize the progressivism of rural Missouri, is a little harder of a sell, even though she is a teacher as well.
Yeah. Force Multiplier, by the way, has been supporting groups through the Rural Democracy Initiative, and it's a facet of our work as well. So there's a related question to the campaign from Tara Lindquist, who sent it in. She says, you would think that being vice president would be the logical stepping stone to president, but it doesn't happen very often. Are there any pitfalls that we should know from history that Kamala Harris can avoid?
That's a great question. And actually, weirdly, you know what was always considered the stepping stone to the presidency was Secretary of State in the 19th century, because that was by far the most important cabinet position, because at that time, that's really what the government did, is it interfaced with other countries. So Secretary of State was supposed to be the stepping stone. Think of Jefferson or Madison, for example. No, I'm not sure the problem is that a vice president stepping up. I think the issue can be that, for example, if you look at George H.W. Bush, who stepped in after Reagan, people who were mad at Reagan went after him because he was a weaker character. And not literally. I don't mean his character was weaker than Reagan's. In many ways, it was stronger than Reagan's. I mean that he appeared to not have the political support that Reagan did. And of course, he was brought down from within his own party. So I would not look for, personally, I would not look for anything that that Harris should worry about. I would expect her, I mean, I'm a prophet of the past, not of the future, but you know, one of the things that you see in a period when you have this sudden broadening of one party, when the other party has jumped down a ditch, what you tend to see is that broader party will have a lot of big successes, and then will start to fall apart as one side or the other of it gets angry and feels like they're not being heard well enough. And that, you know, I don't really know anybody who has managed that 100%. You can look at somebody like LBJ, of course, who was great at that sort of thing, but even LBJ ultimately ended up, you know, with a splintered party.
Could you say a little bit more about the comment you made earlier that you saw parties kind of splitting at some point? Like what kind of path do you see for the Democratic Party and the Republican Party in the future, where one is kind of broadening and the other is narrowing? Well, you just said you weren't the prophet of the future, and here I am asking you that, but
Well, but isn't it fun? You know, you've caught me on a really interesting night because, you know, I know a lot about America's political parties. I know a lot about American politics, but no moment ever exactly echoes the past. And there's so many different factors right now, and they're so interesting. So one of the things that I would say, if you're looking to the future, is that if you look, for example, at the 1850s, when the Democrats you know, jump off cliff, basically. And what that means is the Republicans rise, and they rise out of the remains of the Whig Party, the Democrats who don't go over the cliff with the Southerners, the you know, the Free Soilers, the Know Nothings. You get this kind of conglomerate, and they build this big thing. And if you're looking at that, and many historians who look at that picture try and say, oh, look, you know, they're just the Whigs reborn, or oh, no, they're the Democrats reborn. But what they really do is they take on a brand new set of issues in the 1860s. And of course, the issue of human enslavement is the one that we always focus on because it's paramount. But there's also the issue of the expansion westward. What the heck does that even mean, right? What does it mean to take in all that new territory, filled as it is with people of different races, people who speak different languages, people who have different claims on different areas, including not only indigenous Americans, but also Mexicans who have been the border moved over them in 1848. What is all that going to mean? And the parties have to figure that out. This new Republican Party and the remnants of the Democrats have to figure that out. And what they end up with are two parties that still call themselves Republican and Democratic, but that are centered around entirely new issues in that period. And you can't really tell going into 1860 who's going to end up where in 1870. And so, you ask what's going to happen. I will tell you that America has never successfully been a one-party state. That's never a good thing. It always leads to corruption. And I actually read something interesting about that this morning, and now I can't think of where it is, so I can share it with you. But it always leads to corruption. It always leads to bad governance and so on. We will split into at least two parties. But what will that look like in an era in which we have, with luck, switched to green energy, taking away the influence of oil money? What will that mean when our foreign policy has shifted as dramatically as it has under Biden, so that we are not, for example, trying to impose a Western series of rules on the globe and are instead creating these sort of ad hoc committees to deal with specific individual issues like fentanyl, or like the climate crisis, or like the development of the middle of the African continent. What those things could look like could be anything. But I will tell you, the interesting intellectual part of that is going to be guaranteeing the protection of democracy in a period in which it is possible to concentrate wealth the way it has been done, and how we combat that on a global scale. So I don't have the answer for what's going to happen. I will tell you, it's so important for people who care about this stuff to be engaged and to stay engaged, and to make sure that you don't ever take your marbles and go home, even when you don't get your way, because we're not always going to get our way. But we're going to need to be in there pulling for the rest of our lifetimes to make sure that we protect the idea of human self-determination in this crazily changing time.
Yeah. So true. I want to try to bring in some of the other questions that we received, but now in the chat, and also prior to the meeting. And one thing that a lot of people have been wanting to talk about is that there's been a facet of this sort of elite assault on democracy that has included the capture of the Supreme Court. So Stacey Williams, Alan Greenberg, and a number of other people all wanted to know what you thought could be done to restore an independent Supreme Court, and how much the landscape will change with a Democratic administration and Congress.
The Supreme Court is a huge problem. It is no longer an adjudicator of the law. It is now nakedly partisan, and there is nothing that is more important in our history, as far as I'm concerned, than the Supreme Court's decision of July 1st, 2024, in Donald J. Trump versus United States, in which the Supreme Court said that the president cannot be prosecuted for crimes committed as part of his official duties, and should have a presumption of innocence in official duties that are not within that Article 2 definition. That overturns the entire premise of the United States of America, that nobody is above the law. It also messes up a number of other things as well around the globe. For example, we did not in the United States participate or sign on to the International Court of Justice because we argued that our own courts already provided impartial justice. And now our Supreme Court quite literally has said we're not going to do that anymore. So what does that do to the fact we are no longer able to argue to the International Criminal Court that we don't need to, or the International Court of Justice, that we don't need that that particular rulemaking body any longer, because we have our own, because we don't any longer. Anyway, the Supreme Court having done that is a huge problem, and we don't have time to go into the history of how that happened, but it's a real issue. But there are many things that need to happen to the Supreme Court. One is it does need to expand. As you know, it is not, the numbers of people in the Supreme Court are not in the Constitution. It's changed throughout our history. It got set at 9 in 1869 under Ulysses S. Grant. Things have changed a little bit since then. Personally, I'd like to see it go to 13. But that should, in my opinion, that should not be done as a partisan issue. We've got another issue with today's Supreme Court, and that is that, I'm sorry, we have a number of issues. Another one is that when we conceived of the Supreme Court, or when the framers of the Constitution conceived of the Supreme Court, we didn't have modern transportation, we didn't have modern medicine. So you used to have to travel around the circuit on a freaking horse. Right? It was a young man's game. People, think of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She was not going to be riding around the circuit on a freaking horse. And lots of the people that are currently there now also would not be on a horse, right? Similarly, people didn't live the lifetimes that they live now. And it was very common for people to step on and off the court. You weren't ever supposed to stay there holding on like grim death, right? So the idea of term limits, I think, is also a good one. But in the short term, rather than sort of saying we'll just put in people around those who are our problem, we have the really obvious problem of 2 Supreme Court justices who are taking bribes, openly taking bribes. And as you know, there are 20 signatories to impeaching Justices Thomas and Justice Alito. There's also the issue of Neil Gorsuch's sale of land to somebody who was in front of the court. And there is also the fact that Brett Kavanaugh's background check never really took place. I would like to see real pressure put on those people, at the very least, to get them to retire in the next administration, since both Thomas and Alito are already over 70. That doesn't seem unreasonable right there. But what people can do in the short term, of course, is elect Democrats, right? But in the short term is to keep pressure up on those issues, because this is not tenable. And one of the things that really worries me is it's very clear to me that Trump is not trying to win this election by winning a majority of votes. He's trying to game the system, either by getting it thrown into the House of Representatives, where every state gets a single vote, or by eventually getting it in front of the Supreme Court, where he can expect that the 6 justices will decide in his favor. And if you had asked me on June 30th if I thought that they would do that, I would have said no. That being on the Supreme Court carries with it an imprimatur of enough gravitas that you would not turn into naked partisans in favor of a single man. After July 1st, I don't believe that anymore. I think they would hand it to him. So that's pressure that needs to be kept up before this election.
Yeah, that's probably been the number one question in both in chat and in questions that were submitted earlier, is this issue of certifying the election, where Democrats are all focused on turning out the vote and winning the election. But we already know that the Republicans will not accept the results. So what needs to be done to really protect the democratic process this time around?
So just remember that this has been happening since 2020, and Mark Elias of Democracy Docket, who's been fighting these cases since 2020, is on top of them. So there is in every state a system by which people who refuse to certify elections can be charged in court, can be, taken to court and be forced to certify elections. There is a system, but of course, the hope on the part of Trump is going to be that there will be enough confusion around certain states in 2024 that there will not be certified votes before the counting of the electoral votes. And just to be clear, people have asked me repeatedly if Vice President Harris can certify the votes in where they count them, like they did on January 6, 2021. To be clear, the vice president does not certify the votes. The states certify the votes, and they do so in different ways. And then those certified votes go to the National Archivist, who records them. And then in that joint session of Congress, the vice president opens them and counts them. But if you can mess that situation up in the states, the hope, I think, on the part of the Republicans, and this is my reading of the tea leaves, I don't have ears in that camp, is that there will not be enough electoral votes to certify a winner in 2024. So it will get thrown into the House of Representatives where each state gets a single vote. And if there are more Republican-dominated states than Democratic-dominated states, Trump could win based in that alone. And then if there's a problem in any of those things, it could be thrown into the Supreme Court. And this is, when I say reading the tea leaves, this was the plan in 2020, just thanks to the fact that a number of people refused to go along with it in different states, and then Mike Pence refused to go along with it in the counting, and then Nancy Pelosi got everybody back inside that session to vote the electors in place. It didn't happen, but this was the plan in 2020. So that's what has me concerned. And what one does is to be aware of it, to support those who are fighting in court, people like Mark Elias and the other people who are working on that, but also turn out voters. Because if this is a landslide election up and down the ticket, it's not going to be an issue. The issue is going to be those states where it's too close to count or too close to be obvious. And that if we make it a landslide election, it's not going to be fuzzy enough that someone's going to say, hey, we can't count Arizona, or hey, we can't count Georgia.
Amen to that. And that really speaks to the work that we're supporting tonight with the Blue Surge Turnout Fund. These are groups, 40 groups across the country in these key states, and they are turning out voters that can really help produce that result. Heather, what does history tell us about the role of ordinary citizens at times like these? I think a lot of people are wondering, what can I do? What should I do? How much do our actions matter in a moment like this?
I love this. So think about authoritarianism. The whole point of authoritarianism is that ordinary people don't matter, right? You've got, in authoritarianism, some people are better than others. And that means that a very few people are better than the majority of people. And then there's one person who's better than everybody else. And so if you are in an authoritarian system and you're trying to change society, the way that you do that is by being the person at the top. And one of the things that has always, people asked me when things got real dark in there, people always asked me why I had hope. And I would always say, because of you. Because in American history, it has always been the American people who defended democracy, even people who couldn't vote. So if you think, for example, about the establishment of the Declaration of Independence, great document, right? Except it only applied to a few fairly wealthy white men. Immediately upon the writing of that, people of color, women, indigenous Americans started saying, well, these are great ideas, but what about me? And by articulating the human quest for self-determination based in that document, we have seen that expansion, that document and the principles in that document expand ever since. So if you look at those principles, but then if you look at specific moments, so for example, if you lived in America in 1853, it looked like the elite Southern enslavers had gotten everything. They had control of the White House, they had control of the Senate, they had control of the Supreme Court. And they were quite articulate. They literally said, we reject the Declaration of the Independence, and we reject the idea that people should have the right to consent to the government under which we live. We reject those principles. We believe we are the ones who understand how the world works, and we're the ones who should get to decide how society works, how the economy works, and how the American government works. And in 1854, they pushed through the House of Representatives, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and that would allow human enslavement to move to the American West, where new slave states would be able to work with the Southern slave states to overawe the Eastern Northern states, and the United States would become a slave-holding republic. From there, these few people, these elite Southern enslavers, would take over the American economy, and then they would take over the global economy. And they were really articulate about this. So if you want to take a look at it, look at Alexander Stevens's cornerstone speech, which is the one in which he talks about how the cornerstone of the Confederacy is human enslavement. But he says, we're going to spread this around the world. We are the vanguard of a new way of looking at the world, and we're going to create the world anew, right? You sort of, that's a line from Thomas Paine, but that's the idea of that speech. And yet when they pushed through this law across the North, these people who are farmers and they're shopkeepers and they haven't really been paying attention to politics, take a look at this and they're like, we don't agree with each other about immigration or about finance or about internal improvements, but we can agree that we don't want to turn our democracy over to a few rich white guys who are going to lord it over the rest of us. And they organized in 1854, they organized against the Kansas-Nebraska Act. By 1856, they're the Republican Party. By 1859, Abraham Lincoln has talked about a government that responds to ordinary Americans. By 1860, they've got him in the White House. By 1863, he has issued the Emancipation Proclamation calling for an end to human enslavement. And by November of 1863, he has given the Gettysburg Address calling for a new birth of freedom and the defense of a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And he didn't do that on his own. He did that because ordinary people spoke up. They turned out. They supported people who would defend American democracy. They joined together in communities. They spoke out about their values, and they created a new nation. We got the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and we have lived in their debt ever since. So what people really need to understand in this moment is leaders answer to us. It's about us. It's about what we want and the leaders that we choose. And the way that you make those leaders respond is by speaking out, by getting your neighbors to speak out, by talking to people, by using things like force multiplier to turn out those people who care about American democracy. And in the 1860s, we did it. In the 1880s, we did it. In the 1930s, we did it. And we're going to do it again. And I gotta say, to watch it happening around us, for years I've said, when America turns, it turns on a dime. And I kept sitting there going, but when? When is this going to happen? There was even a week when I thought that the Republicans' attack on the Export-Import Bank in the 1990s was going to do it. And yes, I'm a nerd. But when I look at what's happened in this country since Biden on July 21st said he was not going to accept the nomination for president, we're turning on a dime and we're part of it. And it's an incredibly exciting place to be.
It really is. I just want to say that for those of you who'd like to learn more about what you can do through Force Multiplier, we're having a special information session tomorrow. There's a link to sign up in chat, but we have work to do together, and I hope you'll join us. Heather, last question. Do you see any differences between the pro-democracy coalition of today and some of these earlier periods of history that you're talking about?
I do, and actually, I'm quietly starting a new book on this. The central change, and I wish we had more time in this moment, I think, is that women have centered the anchoring of American democracy. That women have always been involved in our democracy, but in this moment, it is women who are providing the ballast for the country and are organizing to protect American democracy. And that means an entirely new set of voices, and it means an entirely new set of priorities going forward. And it much more accurately, I think, reflects the history of where we have always been. It's just that women are finally, for a number of reasons, coming into their own. And that is, as I say, an entirely new era in American democracy.
Thank you. Okay, so before a final word from Heather, I want to say that over 2,000 of us have pooled our resources tonight. In donations that have averaging about $100, we've raised over $200,000 to support the work of building democracy in battleground states. And this is providing resources to groups like Living United for Change in Arizona, Black Male Voter Project in Georgia, Western Native Voice in Montana, Somos Votante in Nevada, and 36 other groups in battleground states. And it's enabling them to connect with voters who might not otherwise vote. And they really could be the difference this November. It could help us build the kind of landslide that Heather was talking about. And, it's easy to think that the only characters in this story are the candidates and the parties, but there's also a movement. It's out there, it's operating at a scale that can change the course of this election. And there's also us. As FDR said, we're all characters in this living book of democracy, but we are also its authors. We have a role to play in writing the next chapter of our democracy, and your support tonight is helping us to do that. So thank you. And again, I hope we'll see some of you at our info session tomorrow night. Heather, do you have any final words for our community? We're so grateful you joined us tonight.
Well, I'm thrilled to be here. And my final words are exactly that. This is a movement and it depends on us, and our leaders work for us. And this is our moment to get out there and choose democracy and to choose our future. And I feel so incredibly honored to be part of this movement and to be part of it with you all. So let's do this.
Great.